Good afternoon. Welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. We're so glad you could join us today. My name is Jody Murray Burns, one of the co-chairs of the SWS Webinar Planning Committee and a fellow PWS, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for today's webinar. We are excited to share an SWS e-learning experience during a time when many of us are looking for virtual opportunities to stay engaged and gain more continuing education credits. This webinar is one way to stay connected to the wetland community during the global pandemic, and we hope everyone is doing well. Today's lecture and topic will be the role of wetlands and wet meadows in the conservation of the American burying beetle in Nebraska. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. W. Wyatt Hoback. Dr. Hoback is a professor of entomology at Oklahoma State University after serving as a professor of biology for 15 years at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. His primary focus is teaching, and he instructs more than 700 students per year on the interactions between insects and humans. He also teaches various courses of entomology majors. Wyatt has been recognized for his teaching accomplishments and is a recipient of the Entomological Society of America's 2017 Distinguished Achievement Award in Teaching and the USDA Student Engagement Award. He has conducted research on the American burying beetle for more than 23 years and has sampled the species in South Dakota, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Hoback.
Jody, thank you so much for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I am going to share my screen. And we'll get started. Hopefully everyone can see that. So again, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's a little odd that I'll be talking about a terrestrial insect today, but I want to highlight the role of wetlands in Nebraska in preserving this species occurrence in the state. So I wanted to share just a little bit of background about me. I've taken a kind of strange course to get to this point, but I've always been really interested in how species co-occur. Then I wanted to share some information about the American burying beetle, because I'm not sure how familiar you are with this species. It's not an aquatic species, but you could find it in certain wetlands in the US. And then I wanted to share some of the basic science we've done to figure out the biology of the species. And we'll finish up with the role of wetlands in conserving the species and possibly giving us new directions to introduce it. So, a little tiny bit about me. I grew up in Virginia, and I got my undergrad degree in 1990. I studied ecology, and part of that research, I took a trip to Peru, and I observed these insects on a leaf. They're called tiger beetles. With my undergraduate, I then continued work on tiger beetles, and this is an endangered species. It's called Cicindela dorsalis dorsalis, the eastern tiger beetle. I got to chase it around on beaches near Bethel County, Maryland. Well, I did construction a couple of years because I couldn't get a job with a biology degree. And then when they wanted to ship our crew north, I went back to school. And I entered Missouri State University. I received a master's, and there I worked on amphipods. So something you're probably familiar with, side swimmers or scuds. And pictured here is a male carrying a female around, waiting for her to molt. That's when she's able to be mated with. So if you notice tiger beetles, well, the male is riding on top of the female, guarding her from other males. So I really enjoyed that, but I enjoyed teaching students. And when I finished my master's, I wanted to become a college professor to teach. I went to Lincoln, Nebraska to earn my Ph.D., and my research was again on tiger beetles. And with these tiger beetles, I worked at a salt flat near Lincoln, Nebraska, which is now home to this species, which is Cicindela nevatica lincolniana, a federally endangered species. But there's a bunch of tiger beetles that co-occur, and part of how they co-occur is seasonal flooding of these otherwise very dry salt flats keeps the plants from growing and also takes out some other competitors. So I did research on how long a terrestrial insect can survive being underwater. And it turns out for these tiger beetles, it's about a week. Well, then I ended up at Kearney. I was hired as an invertebrate biologist, and the first course I was to teach was ichthyology, which is most definitely not invertebrates. So luckily, I had had a lot of experience thinking about how closely related species can co-occur. I'd worked on those tiger beetles in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'd worked on carrion beetles during my Ph.D. with a fellow grad student named John Beddick. And fishes are really like tiger beetles and bearing beetles. There's a lot of species that co-occur. So bearing beetles. It's in the family Sylphidae. There are 13 genera and about 30 species in North America. They're split into two subfamilies based on their behavior. The Nicrophorinae, or Nicrophorus, are the burying beetles, and they're recognizable by orange and black. And you notice that there's more than one that is orange and black, right? A lot of people say, oh yeah, I've seen this, but the only one that is the American burying beetle and federally protected has this orange shield behind its head. The rest do not have that orange pattern. These other beetles attracted to dead things are Sylphinae, and they're formerly called the carrion beetles. So when we look at burying beetles, they've got that orange and black characteristic. The biggest in North America is the American burying beetle, and it's also the prettiest in my opinion. So I started out doing research in Nebraska. I worked there for more than 15 years, and I compared my findings with those reported from Oklahoma and Arkansas. Well, in Nebraska, we have a bunch of common burying beetles. They include this guy, which is marginatus, this guy, which is carolinus. And of course, we've got American burying beetles and then a species called orbiculus. Well, when I came down here to Oklahoma, I couldn't catch a marginatus or a carolinus. They are present in the state, but in very low numbers. Instead, what we've got are lots of orbiculus and lots of this species, apustulatus, which does not occur commonly in Nebraska. So the first time of many today that I will tell you the American burying beetle population of Nebraska and South Dakota is different than the American burying beetle population of Oklahoma and Arkansas. Why are they called a burying beetle? Well, they literally bury small dead animals in the ground. So beetles search the environment for something dead. They find it by smell. When they arrive at the body, they crawl underneath it. They do push-ups to see how much it weighs. And if it's the right weight, they test the soil. And if the soil is soft enough, a male and female work together to bury the carcass in the ground. As it sinks in, they compact it into a ball. Then they strip off the fur of the feathers. This gets rid of fly eggs. After that, they coat the carcass in secretions. And those secretions make the brood ball not rot, even though it's meat at room temperature. Now they bury carcasses really fast. So this is a time-lapse video of about 1 hour of two burying beetles burying a mouse. Here's the mouse on the surface. It's available for flies and birds and coyotes. And here's two beetles, 1 hour, making that mouse disappear. That's amazing, right? And so why do we care about burying beetles? It's just a bug, and there are more than one species of burying beetle. And that's a question I often get by ranchers, by homeowners, by others. What good is it? Well, because it's the largest species, it uses the largest animals. So it buries things the size of quail, small grouse, voles, cotton rats, prairie dogs. And if you think about what happens to dead animals, maybe you saw a squirrel on your way to work today that was hit by a car. Insects will clean it up, right? So dead animals attract things like flies. And of course, you know flies because as you sit and eat your picnic lunch, flies arrive. And they may have come from a dead body. They may have come from feces. They're transporting a lot of potential microorganisms that can cause disease. You've not seen burying beetles come to your picnic lunch. So one thing they do for us is reduce the breeding ground for flies. Second thing, as I mentioned, once it's buried, they've got to use the resources in that carcass for a period of up to 6 weeks. Now, if you think about leftover Thanksgiving dinner and burying it in your backyard, you come back in a week, you give it the sniff test, and it smells bad. It smells bad because of bacteria. So, burying beetles, coat it with saliva that prevents bacteria and fungi from growing. And that might be a new source of antibiotics for humans or livestock. It also might be a way we can preserve meat at room temperature. Because American burying beetles are the largest species, they have the most potential compounds that humans can use. You may have heard of the burying beetle. Maybe you do consulting, and it's one of the species, depending on which state you're in, that is protected. It once occurred in 35 US states, 3 Canadian provinces. Currently, there are natural populations in 6 states, and in 1989, it was declared endangered. So if we draw an outline around this distribution, this is all the places it used to be, and these brownish shaded areas are the places it is currently. Well, if you've been following the news, in 2020, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that it was no longer endangered, but rather it was recovered. So they downregulated, downclassified it from endangered to threatened. And you're probably wondering why and how I feel about that. Well, of course, when I was going up for my promotion seminar, I said, look, I've done research on this species for 23 years, and now it's recovered. Kind of took the credit for it, even though I don't think it's out of danger yet. So when it was listed as endangered, the beetle was known from one county of Oklahoma and from an island off of Rhode Island. That was it for the United States. Looking back through the published records, it was known much more widespread, right? So 1900s, it's from all these different states through the 1950s, and then something bad happened. So it started disappearing in the 50s, 60s to 80s, and then it was only known from Oklahoma and Rhode Island. Today, we know that it's more common than we thought. In a couple places in western US, it still occurs over here in Rhode Island. So from the historic population, all these white dots, to where it was known after 1998, when I started working on the species. We had found it in Nebraska in a couple of places and had discovered a beetle from the Sandhills based on an insect collection that a student turned in to State Fair. So this part of Nebraska. This was the work that John Beddick did. It was in the Loess Canyons of Nebraska. And so second time, I'm going to tell you populations of American burying beetle are different in different places. So in Nebraska, there's actually 3 separated populations that occur in different habitats. And they are all different than those in Oklahoma. The way that we established the presence, we went out and sampled using little bait cups, usually rotten chicken liver. When we first started, we were using roadkill. Beetles show up in these cups. There's a lot of them. There was a problem. And so we had to make some adjustments to the protocol. We also killed a number of American burying beetles because in these cups, they had no room. They compete very strongly, and something else was killing them that I'll share in just a minute. So John Beddick, this guy did these wonderful illustrations. You can tell males from females, which is really handy. Many insects look the same externally, but American burying beetles, males have this rectangle and females have this little triangle on their face. We marked them. They fly a long way. We got knowledge of their life history. And John tested different ways to trap them. And we went from cup transects to 5-gallon buckets buried in the ground. Now, if you are a consultant in Oklahoma, in the past, you used these little cups spaced 30 meters apart, 8 of them, and you sampled with closed bait in a jar. And you did that for 3 days, presence absence. Today, if you sample in Oklahoma, you still use a 5-gallon bucket. It's above ground. You use a whole rat, typically, also different parts, chicken, liver, things like that, and you do a 5-day survey. That was based on our results, our research in Nebraska. And even in these big 5-gallon buckets, we still had trap mortality. And I went out to visit John's sites, and the dirt in the trap was very dry. And we took beetles back and we put them in growth chambers and a related species called marginatus, another Nicrophorus. And we came back to check on them about 10 hours later, and they were all dead. So we did a series of experiments, and this is where wetlands become really important for bearing beetles. When you look at the rate of water loss of most insects, it's kind of low. Most insects function more or less like reptiles. This is a tiger beetle that's adapted to very dry conditions. It loses water very slowly. This is a bess beetle, a beetle that lives in moist logs, and it loses water pretty fast. This is the bearing beetle, Nicrophorus marginatus. It loses water at a rate almost like a frog. 30% water loss in about 10 hours. That's enough to kill the beetle in a trap between the time that you set it and the time you check the next morning. It's crazy. And it turns out that these beetles avoid the hottest part of the day. So when you're looking in your traps in the early morning, they're present, then they go away in the afternoon, then they become really active late evening, and they disappear at night. So these beetles that are day active avoid the hottest times, and they look for moisture. What about a night active American bearing beetle? Again, they're like frogs. They die really fast if they're in dry conditions. So that's going to affect where we find the beetles. It also changed how we sample for them. We add moist soil to the traps instead of dry soil. That led us to ask if American bearing beetle is limited by moisture in the state of Oklahoma or Nebraska. To do that, we sampled a lot. Every one of the dots on this map is a 5-gallon bucket that's buried in the soil. I have dug probably 1,200 of these buckets in my career. And when we do that, we dug a whole bunch out west where it's dry and got 0 beetles captured. We dug a whole bunch of traps out east where it's very wet. We got 0 beetles captured. We dug a whole bunch of traps here in the north central, and we got a lot of positives. Here in the Loess Canyons, we got a lot of positives, but a lot of negatives around it. And in the middle of these two, a lot of negatives. Well, there's something going on that I will share with you a little bit later on in the presentation that explains why the beetles aren't here or here, even though they should be. And this also ties into why they're endangered. All that sampling resulted in new county records. We found beetles in places that they were not known before. This doesn't mean they expanded their range, which is one argument that's been made during the delisting. They did not grow based on conservation. We looked in places we never had before, and we found them. We did some population estimates using these little numbered B tags. Later, we found those weren't great, and a student here at OSU developed the cauterizing method, which is now the standard. So you do branding. Basically, you expose this to heat, it gets rid of the orange mark, and it's very clear that you've caught that beetle before. Technology is advanced. We are able to model populations, and we ran a couple of models looking at the northern and southern populations, and figuring out how they relate to moisture. Moisture is very important in South Dakota. Moisture is very important in northern Nebraska. Moisture is not that important in Oklahoma. Why is that? Well, as we look at the historic presence of wetlands in the U.S., we see some very wet areas, drier areas, and this is the Sandhills. This is the parts of Oklahoma where beetles are pretty common, parts of Arkansas. So a lot of wetlands in the U.S. But of course, lots of pressure on these wetlands. So as we look at states where the greatest loss of wetlands has occurred, what explains it? In Iowa, corn and soybean. Illinois, corn. Missouri, corn. Eastern Nebraska, corn. Kansas, corn, wheat, and soybean. We have converted wetlands to productive farmland in a lot of places. So the reason that American burying beetles have declined from their historic distribution is ultimately habitat change, right? We have put in cities, we've put in agriculture, center pivots. Cities have light pollution. We took out the most abundant bird species to ever exist on the planet, the passenger pigeon, and it was the right size for American burying beetles that overlapped its distribution. We've increased scavengers, dogs, cats, meso scavengers like raccoons and coyotes have responded to human changes. We've lit up the world, and American burying beetles are night active and attracted to light. And we've put out some pesticides. So today, Fish and Wildlife Service did that species assessment review before concluding that they should downlist it. They broke the populations of American burying beetles into sections: Red River, Arkansas River, Flint Hills, Loess Canyons, Sandhills, Niobrara River, and way over there in Block Island on the East Coast. They looked at capture rates, and as we look at positive surveys, negative surveys, and percent positive, well, about 10% of traps here, about 25% of traps, about 50% of traps are positive. So in good habitat, American burying beetles are doing well. But they're not doing well most places. So I wanted to share just a little bit with you about how we know what we know, right? One of the things that I stake my reputation on is asking to see the data. And working with the Fish and Wildlife Service for 20 plus years, we've changed protocols based on them making conclusions that there was no data for. So we collected the data and then we had better information. We know that beetles are active at night between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. They're attracted to any type of dead animal. They can move more than a mile, and in one night in Nebraska, they moved about 18 miles. It was wind aided, but one night we caught a beetle, marked it. The next night it was 18 miles away. And there's differences in their activity pattern. So one of the things that makes it difficult to manage the species, they're only above ground where you can catch them for certain times of the year. So these beetles have a 1-year life cycle. They spend most of their time underground, and when it's cold, temperatures are below 60 degrees at midnight, they're not out in the environment. They emerge when it gets warm, they find a dead animal, the adults that overwintered reproduce on it, make new. The ones that had survived from the previous winter die. The new beetles then overwinter. Well, in the north, there is a frost line. There is hard ice underground. And so beetles go into the ground in September and they come out in May. In southern populations, Oklahoma and Arkansas, they probably go into the ground in late October, and they come out in early April, maybe March, right, when it's warm. Fish and Wildlife Service, in addition to concluding that the species was more secure, also suggested that climate change would take out the southern population, would either affect the overwintering period or would just become too warm for the species to survive. We still have a whole bunch of unknowns about this species, and I've been working on it for 23 years, so maybe I'm not that good of a scientist. We still struggle to establish population size. We don't know for sure why populations remain in some areas and not in others. We don't know exactly what beetles do when they're not in our trap. They're big, beautiful beetles, but they burrow into the soil. They fly more than a mile. Once we release them, we don't know where they go. And we're not even certain how well they overwinter. What we got to know is how to prevent mortality during construction projects and how to conserve the species, right? Hopefully you now believe that it's a really important, cool species. So how do we preserve it, especially in response to climate change? We have lots of construction projects. We need infrastructure. We need windmills, we need pipelines, we need roads, we need hospitals. We determine if beetles are present and then figure out the best mitigation solution. So throughout my career, I've conducted lots of experiments, and you should be wondering, how in the world does this guy test American burying beetles and figure out what they like? And that's a great question. It's not as fancy as you envision. So this is my lab space while I was in Kearney, Nebraska, and those are tents set up indoors. I can release beetles in those tents and then find them again. So within those tents, these are kitty litter boxes filled with different soil conditions, sand and loam, moist and not moist, with leaf litter and without. Release a bunch of beetles, send in your student to not follow proper lab protocols, but look for beetles, find them all, and we can determine, is there a difference in where they go when they're not active? Right? So for a night active species, you go out and sample in the day. For a day active species, 3 a.m., that's Rachel digging through the soil. For American burying beetle, loam that is wet with organic material, loam that is wet without organic, sand that is wet with organic, sand that is wet without organic, and a few that didn't get in the soil. Not a single beetle was collected in dry soil. Makes sense because burying beetles are like frogs. But this shows for American burying beetle, they like wet soil and some vegetative layer on top. Well, while I was in Nebraska, the Department of Roads provided funding, and Fish and Wildlife said, you cannot park your vehicles on the sides of roads at wet meadows because you're crushing beetles. Well, it sounds logical. Where's your data, right? Well, we don't have it. How in the world can you test if these vehicles are killing beetles? Easy. We built metal containers, filled them with soil, put beetles in, laid turf grass on top, and drove over them with a F-250 truck. Not fancy, but it worked. We did not test American burying beetles. Instead, we tested 2 other species, Marginatus, you've heard of before, day active, and Carolinus, a big species. Driving over these beetles did not result in mortality. The soil provides enough buffer that buried beetles are not crushed. So we allowed Nebraska Department of Roads to be safe, pulling their vehicles off on the sides of the road, and no worries about crushing beetles. Well, in our experiment, we're kind of putting them under the soil and laying some soil on top and then, driving over them. Is that realistic? How deep are the beetles burying themselves? We tested that. We used 4-inch PVC pipe that we cut in half, filled with soil, duct taped. We went through thousands of feet of duct tape, allowed the beetles to become inactive, and then tipped these tubes on their side, very quickly sliced them open, and recorded how deep the beetle is. And we did this with a bunch of different species. So we did it with marginatus, day active, night active orbiculus, day active carolinus. Some of them are burying really deep, 70 centimeters. Over here is the night active Nicrophorus americanus, ABB. And both males and females are about 20 centimeters deep, about 10 inches under the soil. So our metal troughs for driving over them were just about perfect. And we now know how deep beetles are, which allows us to know if you can drive an ATV or a tractor out into the habitats where they exist. So, from all that Nebraska work, during inactivity, beetles seek moist soil. How moist remains to be determined. It can't be so moist that they drowned, right? They're not in lakes, but they are in very moist soil. And they're not affected by vehicle traffic. 9 years ago, position in Oklahoma State Department of Entomology opened up, and I left Nebraska to come here. Part of my incentive was to actually work on the American bearing beetle in Oklahoma, because I thought either Oklahomans didn't know what they were doing, or what I was hoping, the species is different here. And that's what I found. And I connected in to some funding from Camp Gruber, Army National Guard, which are required to monitor endangered species while doing their training activities. So every other week, we sampled beetles at a bunch of places, and we did population estimates. Camp Gruber is a mixture of habitats, grassland, forest, and some wetland areas. We used above ground traps because Oklahomans weren't wimpy. The soil is impossible to dig a 5-gallon bucket into. There's rocks and clay, and we can hang these traps in the tree. The beetles land on the platform, fall in, we're good to go. We measure their size, we sex them, then we release them. We used population estimates, a technique which looks at multiple recaptures. And the main thing I wanted you to see is that populations are variable. Insects are not like whooping cranes or fish exactly. They undergo rapid increases and rapid decreases. They are R-selected. So in 2016, we caught 242. 2017, we caught 449. Not many recaptures, ever. These beetles, we mark them, and they disappear into the environment. But overall, there was an increase. We've tracked it through 2021. There's kind of a downward trend right now. We've had some massive flooding, some really hot temperatures, but ABB are still present in Oklahoma at about the numbers we observed in 2016. Throughout the year, they come out, populations vary. In the winter months, they're low numbers, maybe not zero. Summer months, much higher. Still have a bunch of research needs. We need to do some basic science on the physiology of the species. We really need to start focusing on their response to climate change. Fish and Wildlife has already written off the southern population, concluding they will disappear in 15 years. That may be true. We don't have data that supports that yet. So what about overwintering? How fast does a carcass decompose at warmer temperatures? How much problem is warmer temperatures in terms of using up their energy or not being able to fly? How does competition with other species they co-occur with work? And if we truly want to move populations of beetles, what's the right number? What's the right habitat to introduce them to? These are climate predictions, right? So Fish and Wildlife went with some models that show drastic changes in the South. And temperature is going to be an issue. Our planet is getting warmer. But as we're seeing in places like Montana and in places like Colorado and New Mexico, not only is temperature changing, precipitation patterns are changing. And we are projected to lose soil moisture in a couple of places, including Nebraska and Oklahoma, places that the beetle still occurs. If we lose moisture, we lose wetlands. And wetlands are a critical resource for so many species. They provide moisture to plants. Plants provide food for wildlife. That wildlife is food for American-bearing beetles. A wetland complex protects habitat, a large area, lots of factors, and it buffers environmental change. So this is a model out of Nebraska that shows how wetlands protect productivity of surrounding vegetation, even in periods of severe drought. Nebraska is a little bit special in terms of wetlands. It has a water table that's very close to the surface. So as we think about where American-bearing beetles occur in Nebraska, we can draw these models based on buffers of 20 miles, positive captures. And this looks pretty good, like there's a lot of beetles there. But as we zoom in, we start to see something on the map. So this orange line is where I can catch American-bearing beetles very consistently. And you'll notice this green on Google Earth, that's green vegetation. And you notice this brown, that's high and dry sandhills. And American-bearing beetles are not there, but they are in these areas of green. And then we look at all the other green on this map, and we notice that it looks a little different than this. If you look closely, those greens are circles. In fact, they're pivots. Center pivots, and they are irrigated by subsurface water, drilling into the Ogallala Aquifer. We have lots and lots and lots of farms. Here's Orchard, Royal, and Inman is right down here. Okay, so Inman. The area that maintains American-bearing beetles is green without a whole bunch of circles. The area that doesn't is green partitioned into circles. And the reason that this has not been converted to that, it's too wet. American-bearing beetle in the Sandhills of Nebraska has been protected because the habitat is too wet to grow corn. Climate change could allow more sod to be busted, more agriculture to be introduced. Right now, this area that has shallow groundwater, wet meadows, is used for cows and hay. And those activities also benefit the American-bearing beetle. Much of the rest of this, where the water table's not too shallow, all these little dots are wells, and those wells are being used to irrigate surface agriculture. We are reintroducing American-bearing beetles. Missouri has an experimental population. Ohio has an experimental population. Neither of these reintroductions has been very successful. In Missouri, they're introducing beetles in this prairie. Does that look like Nebraska wetland prairie? Not really. It's pretty dang dry, right? In Ohio, they're introducing them in forests. And that's okay. In Oklahoma, they certainly occur in some forested areas, but more savanna, mixture of trees and grassland. Maybe we're trying to reintroduce the beetles into habitats that don't fit their needs. And maybe wetlands are truly an important resource for beetles. So the beetles being introduced to Ohio are coming from up here in the Sandhills. And this is what they're moving into. The ones in Missouri are being introduced from originally Arkansas. And this is what they're moving into. You know, It's because Fish and Wildlife sees American burying beetle as one species instead of very discrete populations. And maybe reintroductions would go better if we matched. So we've got a breeding facility here at OSU. If you're ever in the area and you want to see American burying beetles, just drop me a line. I'll be happy to take you in and show you the beetles breeding on our carcasses. All this is possible through lots of partnerships. The Tulsa Zoo has provided funding. Insect Adventure has provided space. Cherokee Nation is funding. Camp Gruber. It's led to opportunities for high school students, undergrad research experiences. We've collaborated with the biochemistry department looking at the chemical nature of the secretions. And with that, I want to thank Brenna and Jody especially. They actually reached out to me. They tested all this stuff and maintained wonderful communication. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank you guys, the Society of Wetland Scientists, for hearing the seminar today. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and answer any questions.
Thank you, Wyatt. That was great. Very, very thorough. Appreciate your time and helping us today with this subject. All right. For those who are attending, again, I'll be posing your questions, maybe a few of my own that I received through the Q&A button. I see we have a couple. Let's see, it might have been in the chat, was one of the first ones. The most popular questions that have been upvoted to the top in the Q&A area will be read first. If you forget to ask a question or we run out of time, you can email the presenter at the email address listed on this slide. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first question comes from Hank. He says, great presentation. Thanks. It was fantastic. I'm curious about your soil bearing depth controlled study. Do you also control for temperature for the study? Related, could beetles and ABV specifically been bearing to a specific temperature across different soil types?
So that is a really great question. And part of the reason I shared those pictures of my experimental design, it's all very artificial, right? And so we are just trying to limit the number of variables at one time. So we only tested one soil type for temperature and depth. We tested two soil types for purely moisture. But there's a lot more research that can be done. I just need some space to set up tents and kitty litter boxes and be able to control the temperature of the chamber or whatever the environment I'm putting them in. So that's a great question.
All right, thank you. Another question that's come in from Frank. In your trapping of burying beetles, did you also capture carabid beetles? Do you find the two family groups cohabitate similar wetlands?
And that's another great question. So here in Oklahoma, of course, we have the above ground traps. So we mostly get burying beetles, carrion beetles, and a few big dung beetles. But in Nebraska, we do get carabids. And I wish that I had the time and really ability to learn the species of carabids, because we get some really neat ones. Probably those associated with wetlands are falling into our 5-gallon pitfall traps, at better rates. So they're definitely around. And if someone's interested in the bycatch and is able to identify them, I'd be happy to collect some and share.
All right, thank you. One thought that came to me, and I've never really been clear, and I'm sure you probably have the answers for this. Why in Nebraska are you still like burying your 5-gallon bucket? I'm most familiar with the Oklahoma method of putting it on top and, staking it down so it doesn't get knocked over.
So great question. There's a few things. So first, Nebraska's soil is pretty darn easy to dig in. So it's actually easier to bury it in the ground than to find a tree to attach it to. There's a lot of wide open wetland, grassland areas and maybe a fence post, but there's not a lot above ground. We often sample near cattle, and cattle are very curious. And so that above ground trap just kind of attracts both cows and people. And in Nebraska, curious people wonder why you're putting a rat above ground. So I've tested above ground traps there and they work, but putting them in the ground hides them, keeps them from being disturbed as much. And in Nebraska, you have until noon to check your traps. In Oklahoma, until 10. So that soil buffers the temperature in the trap as well. So that's the main reasons that we've stuck with below ground traps there.
Okay. Is Camp Gruber still monitoring ABB since they've been downlisted to threatened?
Yes, Camp Gruber and the Conservation Banks of Oklahoma are still required to be monitored by Fish and Wildlife Service. The rest of the state, so other projects, private lands, the 4D rule, which it's been an interesting way that the 4D rule has been implemented. For those of you that may not be familiar, the 4D rule was first started with bats. And the idea is that bats have caves that are critical habitat, and they use trees in the summer as temporary shelter. So if you mess up those trees, it's not impacting the bat population. Kind of makes sense. With the beetle, they decided that in Oklahoma, climate change is going to take out the population. So therefore, whatever you do for the population won't matter. And that makes this population in Oklahoma kind of expendable or not critical for the preservation of the species. It's politically motivated. It's not defensible by good science. So now in Oklahoma, we just monitor a couple required places, but the rest of the state doesn't have to worry about beetle anymore. So the 4D rule is also different in Oklahoma than it is in Nebraska. And that's a brand new, different thing than the bat 4D rule.
Mm-hmm. Right. Bringing into something someone said to me about this lawsuit from the Center of Biological Diversity about the downlisting from endangered to threatened. Do you have anything or thoughts you can share with us about the status of that lawsuit?
So the Center for Biological Diversity is a champion for endangered and threatened species. And they are a non-government organization, an NGO, that will look at decisions made by Fish and Wildlife, by Environmental Protection Agency, by other organizations, and they will try to determine if those decisions have been made based on the best available science. So they're kind of a check, in a way, from federal government making all the decisions. When they disagree with a decision, they file a lawsuit, and then the federal government has to respond, and the courts have to decide. So in this case, Fish and Wildlife looked at the available data on the American burying beetle, and there are a lot more numbers and a lot bigger distribution now known than when it was listed in 1989. So that part I agree with. But then Fish and Wildlife concluded that part of the population would be lost, and they used the argument of climate change, which the Trump administration at the time had specifically forbid being used in any of the decisions. So if the administration forbids the use of the words climate change, and the Fish and Wildlife, which is a federal agency, uses it to justify removing protection from a species, that creates some issues that the lawsuit will dig into further. The other problem is they concluded the species should be downlisted, but half the population would be lost. And anytime you're trying to conserve a species, especially one that has a wide distribution and is adapted to local conditions, which I hopefully demonstrated today in this presentation, that's a dangerous road to go down, right? You're saying, well, the population in the South doesn't matter. We'll just focus on the North. So that's the issues the court will have to decide, and the reasons that Center for Biological Diversity launched the lawsuit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Here's another question. What do you think is one of the most valuable characteristics of the ABB that we need to be researching or understanding?
So the thing I didn't mention, when I shared what good is it, that good is based on potential human uses, right? Preservation of meat at room temperature, new antibiotics, control of flies. But American burying beetles serve as umbrella species. They need large areas of undeveloped land to survive. And while they're in that large area of undeveloped land, every other species that uses those resources is also protected. So they're kind of like grizzly bears or wolf packs. They use a large area, and all the species using parts of that area are also protected. So I think wetlands in Nebraska are critical. Without those wetlands, there would be more corn and less American burying beetles. Because American burying beetles are there because it's wet, well, is it that we're saving wetlands, or we're saving the beetle, or we're just saving all that biological diversity because those organisms occur there? And I think that's where we should be really championing species like American burying beetle and others like whooping crane. We have to preserve a migration corridor for this species. So that means we're protecting habitat over a large area. And I think that's a really important goal to keep species around for our great grandchildren.
Very good. I believe we have time for this one last question from Loess. It says, where exactly are you finding ABBs in wetlands? In the wetland proper or on the perimeter? One would think that the saturated soil conditions would be prohibitive for ABB colonization. Anaerobosis.
And so in the lab, we've tested dry soil, moist soil, and very moist soil to the point where it's saturated, and the beetles will get into the saturated soil. But if there's standing water, they avoid that. So these beetles can drown like any other terrestrial organism, but they like it about as wet as we can get it in the lab, in both sandy soil and sandy loam. They're not really fond of clay soils. And of course, clay holds water a little bit differently and it's harder to dig in, but they like it as wet as you can get it. So I would say whatever you define the edge of a wetland as, the transition between water and land, that soil could be having American burying beetles. We've also looked at reservoir shoreline in western Nebraska. A river's dammed up and there's a lake, and they are occurring as close to the lake as we can put traps. So the point where we dig a 5-gallon bucket and the bottom of the hole fills in with water. So these beetles are functioning like amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and they're seeking out wet soil during daytime.
Well, that's very interesting. I didn't understand that they did so well with such wet conditions. I guess we'd always worried about having too much water in our 5-gallon buckets. I mean, of course, we do worry about just the right amount, I guess.
Yeah,
well,
you don't want to drown them. And probably if they're brooding, if they're trying to bury a carcass, they can't bury it in very, very saturated soil because, a little bit of water level change and they drowned.
Right.
But for their daily inactivity, it seems like they like it as wet as you can get it.
Well, that's a big plug for wetlands and preserving wetlands for sure.
Absolutely.
Wyatt, I appreciate your time in preparing and participating. We want to recognize our SWS webinar series sponsors for 2022, Whittington Group, WildNote, Delta Land Services, and In Situ. You can find their information on the websites listed here. Please like, follow, and visit our SWS webinar sponsors. The next Spanish-speaking webinar will be June 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern with two of our Hum Mentor Program mentees who will be speaking about the program. Our next English language webinar will be July 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we will be joined by Eduardo Cejudo for a presentation on karst wetlands in the Yucatan Peninsula. Check out our website and social media channels to learn more and register for these upcoming events. And don't forget to complete the survey that will be sent to you after this webinar to receive a certificate of participation and provide feedback to the webinar series committee. Thanks again for for attending today, and many thanks to our presenter. We really hope everyone has a wonderful day and stays well. Thank you very much, Wyatt.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation and hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you. Everyone have a good day.